Vivian. Thank you for the kind words, and thank you for the invitation to join you virtually. You know, I would love to be there in person, and I look forward to it one day, but I'm also really grateful for the opportunity. And even though we've all done this a whole bunch of times now in different venues, I'm always each time astonished at how easy it is to just kind of appear and meet all these new scholars every time in Antwerp or wherever it is. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity too. And yeah, thank you so much for the kind words and the invitation. I'm going to talk today about my new book that Vivian mentioned, just published last summer with Stanford University Press. It's called Jewish Primitivism. I have here a picture of it that I'll share with you just for a moment. You can see it there. It's available, I guess they say, wherever books are sold, but also through the Stanford University Press website. And what I'm going to do today is talk for a little bit to kind of give a general overview of the book, more oriented toward trying to give you a sense of the questions and issues that I engage with in the book. And then I'm going to go very deep into one of the chapters. I should also say that it was a bit of a challenge for me to choose which chapter I wanted to present today, because I have a chapter on Else Lasker-Schuler and one on Kafka. And I've learned so much from Professor Liska's work on Kafka and Lasker-Schuler that I wouldn't dare present my own, in many ways, inferior commentary to Professor Liska's exposition of these two amazing writers. And then Mark Kaplan shows up, one of our leading Yiddishists who's written so amazingly on Der Nister. But there it is. I'm lucky to be acquainted with and to have learned so much from such amazing scholars, and I'm honored that you're both here to listen to me. So I'm going to be talking today about Der Nister, and I'll say a little bit about who he was, and then get really in depth into how his works relate to the broader book. So I'll just, and at a couple of times towards the beginning, I'll have a few more pictures to show, and I'll just toggle on to that as we go along. So again, to start with, a few minutes about the book in general, and then more in depth on the Yiddish writer Der Nister. In a 1910 speech, the Yiddish writer Yud Lamed Peretz declared, quote, "Two paths lie before us, one path to Europe, where Jewish form will be destroyed, the second path back." By Jewish form, Peretz meant distinctly, recognizably Jewish art and literature. But where was back? His answer: the Bible, Hasidic folklorism, in Yiddish, Bibel, Chassidish, Volksstimmlichkeit. Forward and backward were not the only directions Peretz used to orient his thinking on art. He also went up and down. Quote, "Art is a staircase, and the ground floor is the primitive of the folk," end quote. So Peretz's compass of Jewish art pointed back to the folk and down to the primitive. These are the cardinal points of primitivism. In a 1912 speech, Franz Kafka pronounced, quote, "Once Yiddish has taken hold of you and moved you, and Yiddish is everything, the words, the Hasidic melody, you will have forgotten your former reserve. Then you will come to feel the true unity of Yiddish." In 1914, Kafka asked in his diary, quote, "What do I have in common with Jews? I have hardly anything in common with myself. I should stand quietly in a corner, happy that I can breathe." And in 1915, after visiting a Hasidic gathering in Prague, Kafka commented, quote, "Looked at precisely, it was something like a savage African tribe," end quote. So in the first statement, Kafka sees Yiddish and Eastern European Jewish culture as an exciting repudiation of the hollowed out, westernized Judaism he identified with his father and his upbringing. In the next, he rejects the premise of an exoticizing ethnographic gaze and turns the lens on himself. Relative to the distance he feels from himself, the primitiveness of the Hasidim he would later compare to Africans is beside the point. And in the last, of course, he seems to disparage Hasidic Jews by invoking a racist estimation of Africans. Taken all together, these are examples of Jewish primitivism. They participate in the same agenda as primitivism across European modernity. a critique of modernity activated by the belief that a better way of making art and a better way of living were to be found among those peoples considered by Europeans to lack civilization. Before humans were corrupted by modernity, in fact, before they were corrupted by any civilization at all, so this line of thinking goes, that is when they were truly free, truly creative, truly alive. For civilized peoples, that is, white, Christian, European peoples, this time of freedom, creativity, and vitality ended before recorded history. At the turn of the 20th century, however, European ethnographers and artists believed that such a state could still be found among so-called primitives. And you can imagine the air quotes every time I say the word primitive. Primitives who lived in a permanent state of prehistory. This belief became a powerful impetus for writers and artists. Paul Gauguin, arguably the first artist of modern primitivism, wrote that in order to produce the kind of art he admired, he needed to become, quote, savage in spite of myself. And while this was the goal of most European primitivism, Jewish primitivism asserted a savage identity for Jews, not in spite of themselves, but because of themselves. Primitivism typically takes an object that is distinctly other and definitively not European. So the people generally enlisted by force or by fantasy to play the role of primitives were defined as everything Europeans supposedly were not. Dark-skinned, illiterate, uncivilized, superstitious, pre-logical. So Jewish primitivism by Jews, of Jews, should have been impossible. European Jews were often stereotyped, both by themselves and by others, as too modern, too urban, too political, too literate. And even if Hasidic and other Eastern European Jews superficially resembled more distant so-called primitives, why would European Jews valorize as vital and as free a people actually among the most vulnerable in Europe? After all, neither Jews nor so-called primitive peoples had a place as equals in modern civilized Europe. And Jewish primitivists were certainly not arguing for the exclusion or subjugation of Jews. On the contrary, Jewish primitivism was a product of the effort to create and consolidate identity, Jewish, European identity and nationhood through Jewish culture. European modernity depended, however, on the creation of ineradicable difference between the Jew and the Christian, between the folk and everyone else, between the civilized and the primitive. In imagining European Jews as primitive savages, European Jewish writers and artists blurred the border between savage and civilized. In other words, while primitivism was grounded in difference, Jewish primitivism disassembled that difference, because from the perspective of European art and society, Jews were plausibly primitive, but also plausibly European. The result was a discourse that recognized its own impossibility, a powerful critique of the necessity of Jewish inclusion that began from the premise of inclusion. I'd like to emphasize that Jewish primitivism was not an artistic movement. It had no defined or specific agenda or style. It was instead a project with a direction, back or down, but no destination, a process without a fixed method or goal. The lack of fixity was shared across the various versions of Jewish primitivism. It allowed for ideological flexibility. It could be assimilationist or Zionist, revolutionary or reactionary. It allowed for linguistic flexibility, written in Yiddish, German, and in Hebrew. And it allowed for aesthetic flexibility, neo-romantic and modernist, literary, graphic, photographic, based on models of oral literature and visual arts, realist, and abstract. Jewish primitivism is therefore part and parcel of a broad array of works of art and literature. And the chapters in my book cover a range of these. Not all of them. If I was going to do a list of everything primitivist in Jewish European modernity, I would have had a very, very long and probably boring list. And that would have been most of my book. So my chapters were selected to try to shine a light on the most notable features. And here are, here's one sort of pair of quick examples that I'm not going to be talking about today. Let me just show you a picture. Elsa Lasker-Schuler, the German Jewish poet and artist, introduced herself often in person and signed her correspondence as Prinz Yusuf, chief of the Bund der Wilden Juden, the Society of Savage Jews. These warriors also featured in her poetry, prose, and visual art, narrowing the gaps between genres and media and bridging the chasm between art and life. Although Lasker-Schuler was a bohemian and famously claimed of herself that she was unpolitical, her fantasy of unfettered primitivity revealed that the politics of Jewish primitivism were not only emancipatory, as in her imaginative world, they could also be about domination, as in the Hebrew and Yiddish poetry of Lasker-Schuler's friend Uri Tzvi Greenberg, who borrowed the Society of Savage Jews for his own works. While Lasker-Schuler's savage Jew wore a dagger in his belt, and you can see that in this picture here very faintly, a dagger in the belt inscribed with the Hebrew word ve'ahavta, and thou shalt love. For Greenberg, the savage Jews were an expression of his radical right-wing Zionist vision for the settlement of Palestine. One of the chapters in my book is on that very strange pairing and the poetic relationship around that image of the Society of Savage Jews. In my book, I identify two primary areas in which primitivist art and literature operated: identity and aesthetics. The turn to primitivism was an escape from and a critique of the omnipresent politics of Jewish identity formation. Primitivism worked against the nationalizing aesthetics underlying the modern Jewish culture project because it rejects a stable national or folk identity at all, and consequently rejects a stable archive of artistic themes, texts, or subjects. Without a folk, there can be no canon. Without a collective other, there can be no collective self. And Jewish primitivism was also, of course, an aesthetic enterprise. By uncovering alternative artistic traditions within European Jewish culture, primitivism probed the formal possibilities of art and literature. Artists and writers capitalized on these new developments not only to thematize notions of Jewish identity, but above all to transform their works as such. The results were diverse. My aim in the book wasn't to offer an exhaustive list, as I said, but to begin drawing the map of Jewish primitivism and to point out some of its most notable features. My book shows that Jewish primitivism encompassed a range of techniques and possibilities conditioned both by the aesthetics of primitivist modernism and the politics of Jewish identity in Europe, but that it was ultimately responsive to its own internal aesthetic agenda. This is especially true for the piece of the book that I'm going to present to you now about the Yiddish writer der Nister. As you consider how it fits into what I've just sketched, you'll see that it's a case right at the limits of Jewish primitivism, where a distinctively Jewish identity is no longer directly or explicitly in play. It is instead replaced by a universalizing primitivism. Yet, der Nister's works were written in Yiddish for a Jewish audience and evoke Ashkenazic and Hasidic folklore. So in the tension between his universal thematics and his Jewish context, der Nister was aiming directly at a troubling question for Yiddish writers, especially those who had revolutionary politics. How Jewish should your writing be? That question itself plays off of another question, perhaps the central question for most European Jewish writers in those decades. What is Jewish literature anyway? Der Nister's approach to primitivism turns it inside out. Instead of essentializing Jewish identity, he diffuses it. This tracked with the general tendency in the avant-garde away from a representational primitivism, showing pictures of so-called savages, toward a formal or conceptual primitivism, reorganizing the art from the inside. Der Nister's Jewish context made the relation and confrontation of these two extremes, the particular and the universal, central to his primitivism. What was at stake for der Nister was not how to make a Jewish version of something universal, but how to make a universal version of something Jewish. Okay, so let's get to it. Let's dive in. I'll start with a quotation from one of der Nister's stories. So I walked and walked on the path and at sunset, which I looked up toward, and from time to time, from one time to the next, found the sun more set and more settled. A minute and two, slowly and more, and the sun already disappeared from the horizon completely. And suddenly, and I saw far, far away facing me, and where the sun set, some kind of small and local animal appeared, and illuminated, it revealed itself and stood still, end quote. These very strange and mystifying lines are by der Nister. If you didn't understand it or thought it was weird, that's good, you're supposed to. The repetition, the rhythm, the non sequiturs, the strange grammar, these are all hallmarks of his obscure style. His pen name signals his resistance to accessibility, der Nister, the hidden one. Born Pinchas Kahanovich in Berdichev, then the Russian Empire, now and hopefully for the foreseeable future still in Ukraine. Born in 1884, der Nister grew up in a pious household, finding his way, like others of his generation, first to Hebrew and then to Yiddish literature. He also eventually found his way, like so many of his peers, to Berlin in the early 1920s. By that point, he had published a number of stories and short books, staking his claim to a style typically associated with Russian symbolism. And although this was not a tack taken by many other Yiddish writers, and though his pseudonym makes it clear that he cultivated this status as an outsider, he was nevertheless actually in the center of the Yiddish avant-garde scene. By the time he came to Berlin in 1921, he had spent about 2 years in Kiev, associated with the writers and artists of the Yiddish Cultural Kulturliga group, and had published books with illustrations by the already famous Marc Chagall and the soon-to-be famous El Lissitzky. But it was in Germany that he was to publish the book that made his name and that remains his best-known contribution to the Yiddish canon, the collection of strange folklore-inspired stories called Gedacht, Imagined, published in Berlin in 2 volumes in 1922 and 23. Der Nister's avant-garde works culminated in a collection of stories written during and just after his German period and published in Kiev in 1929 in a volume titled Fin meine Gitter, From My Estates. These stories all willfully resist interpretation. My approach at deciphering them begins with situating der Nister's works in primitivist theories of art, especially that of the German Jewish art historian and theorist Karl Einstein. In the early stories of Gedacht, the connection to this context first becomes apparent. 2 late stories from Fin meine Gitter show der Nister's fully fledged aesthetics and their political consequences. Reading his works as literary examples of primitivist art and visual theory reveals that they are only obscure if the key to decoding them is derived solely from literary analysis. But while der Nister's prose was of course grounded in both secular and Jewish literary traditions, primitivist visual theory afforded him a way to avoid the political pitfalls of this context. Soviet critics castigated him for his enmeshment in what they saw as a reactionary, ethnically particular bourgeois tradition, because they didn't see that his unique approach allowed him to use old building blocks for a radically new project. Der Nister's primitivism was based on visuality because it was the most effective and maybe even the only way to write literature that achieved 2 interrelated and seemingly unattainable goals: the renunciation of the Western literary tradition that prized individual subjectivity, and the avoidance of Jewish particularity in texts that remained, however, distinctly Yiddish. The obscurity of der Nister's works is explicable as an aesthetics of paradox, literature built out of and against its precedents, Jewish yet universal, individual yet collective, traditional yet revolutionary, visual yet literary. This paradoxical project, together with his difficult style and convoluted plots, makes der Nister's works really, really hard to understand. Critics from his time to the present have taken several tacks. Some have simply registered their confusion. For example, none less than Yud Lamed Peretz himself could not make sense of his putative disciple. After reviewing some of his works, Peretz angrily wrote to der Nister that he couldn't understand them. Der Nister's response, which he fortunately shared only with a colleague and not with Peretz, was to quote the Hasidic master Reb Aaron Karliner: "Konst, nur willst nicht." You can, you just don't want to. In a more productive vein, scholars have situated der Nister in the context of Peretz's folkloric stories or Hasidic literature, done brilliantly by Mark Kaplan, particularly the stories of Reb Nachman of Bratslav, or Russian symbolism, or Der Nister's political leanings. These accounts have explained many of the strange features of his works, particularly their range of themes and symbols. As already noted, some of the strange features of Der Nister's works would also have been familiar to readers of contemporary Russian literature, including the array of styles and techniques commonly called symbolism. For example, his works reflect the symbolist interest in the supernatural and the occult, in mysticism, in folk literature, and mythology. These works can seem kind of generically archaic and obscure, and they evoke myth with a capital M, a kind of hazy myth, rather than any specific or particular myth from any specific culture. Der Nister also shares aspects of the symbolist approach to language, often emphasizing sound over meaning by using frequent repetition and by inventing words chosen for their sounds rather than any semantic flexibility. Another concept, the concept of ornamental prose, described by Der Nister's contemporary, the Russian literary theorist Viktor Shklovsky, is also apt. Shklovsky defined this phenomenon as, quote, a shift in favor of the image within literary texts, which relied on a wide range of rhetorical devices like symbolism, including alliteration and various forms of repetition and rhyme. So these works also had these kind of strange use of words and strange grammar. These techniques are found again and again in Der Nister's stories. It's a central element of what he was doing, but one of the main parts of ornamental prose is missing in Der Nister. Shklovsky writes that in ornamentalism, we find the loosening of plot structure because imagery prevails over plot. In fact, in ornamentalist text, there's often no plot at all. But this absence of narrative, as we'll see, is not a feature of Der Nister's works. The ornamentalism of his prose can distract from what is actually an abundance of plot. Der Nister's stories show an obsession with all the elements of plot, narration, structure, the whole complicated architecture of a story. There's so much of it. So to understand Der Nister, I focus on the form of his stories, not in order to sidestep all of these other aspects that I've discussed, whether his stance to the Soviet Union and the revolutionary potential of art, or his approach to Hasidism or Jewish folklore. In fact, Der Nister's use of visual principles to create works of literature was an ingenious way of fusing all these disparate elements. His works managed to be both universal and particularly Jewish, revolutionary, and connected to tradition. The connection, though, between these various aspects of his work is made through a very distinctive kind of primitivism at work in his texts. At first glance, his primitivism seems to be of a more typical variety, with connections to themes drawn from Jewish, Slavic, and other folk literatures. This so-called soft primitivism was shared by other Yiddish writers in the period who also looked to early forebears like Reb Nachman of Bratslav, or the more recent leader of this literary trend, Peretz. But none of these writers attempted anything near the formal complexity of Der Nister's works. For example, the story Zum Berg, which I quoted from earlier, Zum Berg, to the mountain, from the collection Gedacht, is narrated in the first person about a character called a wanderer, who, under the guidance of an old man, sets out from Granny's house to the mountain. On the way, in the forest, he meets a hunter who tells him a tale. Later, in a steppe, he meets a beggar who tells him a tale. Then by a river, he meets a stork who tells him a tale. Then, after years of wandering, he comes to a cave where he finds a conclave of men clad in black robes. He then meets a fox, an eagle, a mole, and a skull. None of them tells him a tale, but then he meets a cuckoo who does. Finally, at the end of the story, the wanderer hears a voice and sees the cloud man, who then paraphrases to him some of the opening lines of the story, describing the wanderer back in Granny's house. So the degree of, I mean, that's a summary of the story. It's very strange, and it's somewhat hard to keep track of. The degree of narrative complexity here goes far beyond a simple narrative. You know, it's not one day I went walking and then. In fact, what it has is a narrative level that contains an extended sequence of horizontally embedded parallel narratives, kind of like chains hung off of another chain. The conclusion of the story introduces the greatest complication, fusing the primary story back to its own beginning, creating a kind of mise en abîme and excuse me, an endlessly regressing story within a story, like the effect of two mirrors pointed at each other. As the wanderer nears the end of his quest, he finds a scroll and reads it. When he finishes reading it, his experience of wandering combines with the experience of reading, and he, quote, sees, that's the verb in the story, sees his own story, quote, and just when I finished reading the scroll, a thought occurred to me as if from afar, behind me, and seemingly above me. A voice called out to me, wanderer, wanderer. And when I turned to the voice and to the cloud man, I opened my eyes and saw, quietly and at midnight. Those last words are from the first words of the story. So the first person narrator reads and hears and sees the actual beginning of the very text in which he is himself. It punctures the story's frame at its very end, drawing it back to the beginning. The final paragraph is a near quotation of a portion of the beginning of the story. This quotation is introduced with the line, quote, and I opened my eyes and I saw. The wanderer thus actually sees the effect of the narrative turning back on itself. It's not only described visually, but the very device, the mise en abîme, is by definition visual. The term is borrowed from heraldry, the kind of symbols of medieval arms and armor of the nobility, of drawing a smaller shield within the larger shield, and on it goes, again, like the mirrors facing each other. So the way things are represented in art, the mise en abîme, the reflections, is the basis of der Nister's method, the use of principles of visuality to shape literary works. What makes this primitivist? The dramatic ending of Zum Berg, conflating visuality and textuality, images and words, seeing and reading, to scramble the levels of the narrative. This describes a process of seeing that is both part of the plot and also an explanation of the story's structure. This is the entry point to der Nister's primitivism, because the role of seeing in visual perception in the creation of art is the central issue in primitivist aesthetics more broadly. How does primitivist visuality enter into literature? The challenge of relating art to literature or the visual to the textual was a central concern of Karl Einstein, a German Jewish art historian and theorist, who was also one of the earliest champions of Cubism and was one of the first to craft a primitivist aesthetic theory. In a 1921 letter, Einstein wrote, quote, I've long known that this thing we call Cubism goes far beyond painting, end quote. At first glance, this claim makes little sense. Cubism was an artistic movement begun by painters and developed by painters. It was about painting. Yet Einstein maintains that it must be transferable from one artistic realm to another. He went on in the letter, quote, I've long known that not only is a reformation of sight possible, and thereby of the effect of movement, but a reformation of the verbal equivalent is also possible, end quote. Okay, but what would this look like in literature? In the letter, Einstein mentioned a handful of features such a text might have. Quote, the loss of language, or the dissolution of an individual, or the disunification of the sense of time. Simple themes is how he sarcastically concludes that portion of his letter. He also admits in this interesting letter that he himself had tried it in a work of literature, a novella or short story called Bebouquin, and he admits that it didn't work. He couldn't pull it off. Simple themes. We can understand these ideas in relation to his early visual theory, elaborated in a 1915 book called Negroplastik, Negro Sculpture, which offered a primitivist artistic theory that was flexible enough to be applied to literature. So I'm going to kind of walk through this now in a condensed fashion in order to make what's actually quite dense and complicated clearer for the purposes of my argument. Little bits and pieces of it might fall away feel free to follow up in the question and answer period. Einstein's book combines a short essay on African sculpture with 119 photographs. In essence, it was a justification for Cubism based on his interpretation of African sculpture. So while the book was ostensibly about African sculpture, it was actually a theory of primitivist aesthetics. It was a plan for how you could do what was done in African sculpture in contemporary art and literature. This short book, which has been claimed as the first European art historical treatment of African art, this book promotes African sculpture as an antidote to what Einstein believed was the main problem of Western art, namely that its purported naturalism, the way it pretends to look the way the world looks, was not actually about the objective imitation of nature. The nature that it passively imitates is actually and merely the subjective vantage point of the viewer. This is a complicated critique, but one central element of it is the observation that perspective in Western painting always or typically assumes an individual viewer. So the importance of perspective in Western art reflects the way that Western society prizes the individual above the collective. One of Einstein's main innovations in this work is his explanation of the organization of spatial elements in African sculptures, which he argued are, quote, oriented not according to the beholder's point of view, but from within themselves, end quote. The purpose of this reorganization is to eliminate two things, what Einstein calls the temporal function, the function of time, and frontality, like front, seeing something from the front. In other words, the problem with European sculpture is that you have to actually physically move around it in order to see the whole thing, and this takes time. That's the temporal function. You can't like get the whole sculpture until you've taken the few seconds to walk around it. The alternative in Western art was frontality, viewing art from the front, which was enabled either by the illusion of perspective in painting or by sculptures crafted in relief, a kind of flattened sculpture like you might see around the rounded outside of a fountain. African sculpture, Einstein felt, did not have this problem because it absorbed, as he put it, both time and space. By eliminating the need for movement around the sculpture, you could perceive the work of art instantaneously. So there's a lot more to this, but to recapitulate the relevant points. First, rather than representing a fixed image, African sculpture actually represents the process of viewing, a process that's in part physiological, done with the eyes, and in part cognitive, done with the brain. This was what Einstein felt was so important about Cubism. It rejected the possibility of coherence or interpretation and foregrounded the actual experience of viewing itself. Second, rejecting mimetic representation, which is the premise that art copies nature, allows the rejection of what Einstein regarded as the chief culprit in the illusion of Western art, and that's perspective. Third, African sculpture eliminates the need to move through space and through time around the sculpture. The parts of the sculpture are visually fragmented and reintegrated simultaneously. Simultaneity, as such, became one of the most significant techniques and objectives of art in Einstein's aesthetics. The scrambling of time and space will be important when we return to Der Nister. And it's important to point out here that if you're thinking about African art that you may have seen and wondering what he's talking about, he's not actually describing the art in an objective or sort of soberly scholarly way. He's very much using his interpretation of African sculptures to promote a vision for his idea of what European art should be. So there is this, within his art, a certain kind of primitivist appropriation of African sculpture for his own purposes. Finally, what Einstein called the reformation of vision was not only a matter of art, it was also political. In fact, politics is arguably the main goal of Einstein's artistic theory. In short, the revolutionary effect of African sculpture is the destabilizing of the viewing subject, or as Einstein writes toward the end of Negro Sculpture, all individuality is annihilated. By annihilating the way that Western artworks fix their viewers in place, African sculpture creates a different kind of subjectivity. With the elimination of individuality in art, the ground is cleared for revolutionary new forms of social organization. As Einstein wrote elsewhere, quote, primitive art, rejection of the capitalized art tradition. If we explode the ideology of capitalism, we will find beneath it the sole valuable remnant of this shattered continent, the precondition for everything new, the simple masses who are today still burdened by suffering. It is they who are the artist, end quote. Restoring art to the masses required first annihilating the individual and annihilating the myth of individual creativity. That was Einstein's theory. Der Nister would take up all three challenges of Einstein's primitivist theory. First, the transfer of visual principles to literature. Second, the destabilization of aesthetic traditions. And third, the fracturing of the I, the subject, the ego. Situating Der Nister's works in the ideological landscape of avant-garde primitivism clarifies the relation of his stories to his politics, which has been seen as something of a mystery. After his return to the Soviet Union, Der Nister's stories were the subject of a critical debate that was happening in the Yiddish critical press, and very much in person as well, about the matter of what was called Nisterism and its politics. He was accused of being apolitical or worse, reactionary, while his critics tried to portray his work as a bridge between the Jewish avant-garde and acceptable forms of Soviet literature. Among scholars, there is likewise no consensus on how exactly to situate Der Nister's works politically. Some have discerned anti-Soviet critique in his work, while others have pointed to his evolving politics, ranging from an idiosyncratic utopianism to a submission to Soviet aesthetics. I argue that Der Nister's annihilation of individuality should be read as an aesthetic and a political technique. He replaces the individual reader, writer, and protagonist with plural collective forms of description and narration. As with Einstein's primitivist aesthetics, the consequences are far-reaching. Breaking down the individual's centrality clears the way for collectivity. Der Nister's primitivism troubles the question of individuality, so its most striking manifestations are found in two late stories that feature both a first-person narrator and a character named Der Nister. Fin meine Gitte, a story named after, or the collection rather, is named after the story in it, From My Estates, and a second story called A Meise mit a Letz, mit a Mäus und mit dem Nister allein, a tale of an imp, a mouse, and Der Nister himself. Both of these from the collection From My Estates, published in 1929. The complications produced at the intersection of a first-person narrator and a character with the same name as the author, which is already kind of confusing, mark the culmination of Der Nister's primitivist visuality and are the most significant change from his earlier to these later works, which are kind of the pinnacle of his avant-garde phase. In these two stories, Der Nister has found a way to stabilize the authority of the author and to destabilize, the author's authority in the very structure of the story, not merely to describe that process. So I'll talk us through one of these two stories. A Meise mit a Letz, a tale of an imp, a mouse, and Der Nister himself. The story achieves its complexity through a series of very subtle shifts that amount to a narratorial structure that is difficult to determine and just as hard to describe. It took me a very long time to read this story and figure out what was going on, and even longer to figure out how to write it or express it. But that's the point. So here goes. Hold on. Der Nister, the character, acquires the pelt of an imp, the skin, the fur of an imp, which is a kind of demon, for a coat, and is infected with a debilitating and life-threatening disease by an insect which lived in the pelt. A doctor tells him he can only be cured by reuniting the pelt with the imp it came from. Surveying the charnel ground in search of the requisite imp bones, he is aided by a mouse. He is aided by a mouse who had formed a romantic bond with the imp. Der Nister restores the pelt to the correct bones, whereupon the imp is made whole again. The imp and the mouse then proceed to get married. Very nice. For entertainment at the wedding, Der Nister, again hale and hearty, feeling good, tells a tale about der Nister himself. All this takes place in the first 3 pages, and it's about a 40-page story. The remainder of the text, and I'm not going to go through every detail, don't worry. The remainder of the text consists of the tale that der Nister tells. Interestingly, although these first pages, which are in a way the frame narrative, are told in the 3rd person, there's no switch to the 1st person once der Nister's embedded tale begins. The narration continues in the 3rd person. In the first few lines, this is accomplished through indirect speech, meaning that der Nister's voice is approximated even as the 3rd person perspective is maintained. But the text slides promptly into quoted speech, assuming the typical contour of 3rd person omniscient narration. At first, this poses no problems, or relatively few problems. We're told how der Nister travels to a city of glass people and teaches them how to become flesh, how their newfound fleshiness and fattiness caused a mouse infestation, and how they therefore wanted revenge against der Nister, and how der Nister was saved by the arrival of a mouse catcher. So far, so good, right? But here begin the complications. The narrator intrudes to say that the mouse catcher departed because staying there any longer made no sense, since the story would repeat itself again and again. Mouse catcher, mice, fat, and Nister. Nister, fat, mice, and mouse catcher. Note that this is not a direct repetition, but a mirror image. Mouse catcher, mice, fat, and Nister, Nister, fat, mice, and mouse catcher. But the departure of the mouse catcher precipitates exactly that, the development of the rest of the story as a kind of funhouse mirror image of the first part of the story, generally inverted but containing disorienting disfiguration. Moreover, at this point, the narration enters the realm of the impossible. I mean, it was already impossible, but we're still in the story der Nister is telling at the wedding, but the narration now describes events at which der Nister was not present. This impossibility is justified by the narrator once again in terms of the demands of storytelling. If the mouse catcher's story had not proceeded, quote, we would not have had anything more to tell, and the story would have had to be cut off here right in the middle, end quote. The story then continues with the mouse catcher until the narrator says that he cannot continue with the story of the mouse catcher, quote, because there would not be enough paper or ink, and I only want to tell about der Nister himself, end quote. Remember, the whole story is meant to be told by der Nister. So here we finally seem to have a full disconnection of the narratorial voice from der Nister's presumed voice. And here, about halfway through the story's pages, we're finally given the story's proper beginning, learning how it is that der Nister became ill from a bug bite to begin with. Here's how. A man on a star throws a coin to der Nister, who uses it to buy that imp pelt for a coat. But when he begins to scratch and be tortured by his illness, quote, he saw his life backwards in the reverse direction, end quote. What then follows is an inverted version of the first story. Der Nister and his donkey travel to a city of fleshy people and teach them to become glass people devoid of fat. The difference between this and the first version is that this one is described as something der Nister saw. It is in his vision that the narration reverses course and mirrors itself, continuing in this vein until he and his donkey are again pelted with stones, at which point the text again notes that der Nister sees, that's the verb, sees the entire story proceeding backwards. And then der Nister sees, again the Yiddish verb der sehen, the beginning of the story again, the man on the star throwing him a coin. After he envisions all of this, he suddenly sees the insect that bit him, goes to a doctor who tells him the cure, and takes the cure. And so the structural and plot inflection points, the place where the narrative of the story fragments, these are all marked by the verb to see. And if you'll recall, the combination of narrative levels at the end of the story I talked about earlier, to the mountain, is also accomplished through a conflation of the visual and the textual, as the main character sees a quotation from the beginning of his story. It's visuality that determines for Der Nister the possibilities of his literary works. The ending of Meise Mitterletz, a story of an imp, brings us back to the wedding at the beginning of the text where Der Nister was telling his tale. Quote, and Der Nister was healthy again, and mazel tov, and good fortune for all your days. And in thanks and for a wedding present, I give you my insect. And again, mazel tov, and good fortune for all your days, end quote. So as the story ends, the narratorial voice returns to Der Nister and becomes finally first person. A measure of wholeness and normalness is achieved in the wake of the marital union of the mouse and the imp, the reunion of the imp bones with its fur, and Der Nister's own recuperation. It's a happy ending in some ways, yet in the wake of all the various forms of authorial and narrative complication and all the inverted storylines, the gesture toward a proper resolution is strikingly ironic. It becomes as puzzling as the preceding pages of active narrative confusion. The process of breaking apart and reconfiguring, reshaping form and space, or in the case of literature, form and time, is a process of removing the privileged position of the writer, the narrator, and the reader. By amalgamating narratorial voices and eliding differences in perspective, Der Nister suggests that an entity named Der Nister does not and cannot exist. So I've described how the complications of Der Nister's stories reflect a primitivist understanding of art and literary form. The form of the works, as much as their themes and their kind of tricks and rhetorical patterns, are related to avant-garde approaches to ethnographic and folkloric sources. But what he produces isn't a stylization of myth or folklore that remains fully in the grasp of the author. In Der Nister's stories, narration exceeds authorial control, even as it is indisputably a product of authorial invention. So as I've shown by connecting Der Nister's aesthetics to Karl Einstein's, this is primitivism in general, but it's also Jewish primitivism. Only by starting from the folkloric tradition that Yud Lamed Peretz had placed at the center of modern Yiddish literature and building on that tradition, could Der Nister move away from it. In his 1921 Yiddish manifesto Sculptur, the sculptor Yosef Chaikov, a Soviet Jewish sculptor, voiced a critique of primitivism that reveals, by contrast, just what it was that Der Nister accomplished. Describing the recent accomplishments of Jewish sculptors, he asked what connection their innovations relating to abstraction, the depiction of masses in space, the interrelations of pictorial planes, all the avant-garde stuff, what relation that had to Jewish art of the past. His answer? There is no connection because Jews have no tradition of sculpture. Chaikov argued further that because of this complete absence of tradition, the Jewish sculptor is especially fortunate to have access, unfettered access, to the range of developments in the arts from futurism to cubism to constructivism. Only one of these major trends troubles Chaikov, and that is primitivism. He ends his manifesto with a warning against a futile search for a usable past. Quote, "We consider the approach of the young artists of the left incorrect. They wish to solve the problem by recourse to the archive of our past and our folk primitive style. This leads to stylization and stylization to aestheticization. That is a lie given the present circumstances. Capricious individualism in service of beauty," end quote. Although his disdain for primitivist stylization seems absolute, interestingly, Chaikov did admit, although sort of unwittingly, that the situation was not quite so simple. A few pages earlier in the manifesto, describing the various achievements of the schools of the avant-garde, Chaikov noted the debt owed by Cubism to African art. But if Cubism is permitted, so to speak, to draw on African art, which Chaikov celebrated, then Chaikov's refusal to admit that kind of primitivism in Jewish art, despite its presence at the heart of so much of the art he admires, reveals an ideological stance. Revolution, universality, the future, abstraction on one side, reaction, particularity, history, and figuration on the other. The masses on one side, the folk on the other. But Der Nister's stories show that Chaikov's analysis was not quite correct, at least not regarding literature. Der Nister managed to encompass both universality and particularity, tradition and revolution, by structuring his literature visually. The formal complexity of Der Nister's works takes up the challenge that Carl Einstein showed primitive art could pose to the subject-centered traditions, whether in literature or in art, of Western representation. If in the story, A Tale of an Imp, it is difficult to locate the narrator in the chronology of the work, if it's challenging to distinguish the narrator as Der Nister and Der Nister the narrator, and indeed Der Nister the author, then we found the crucial step in the conversion from I to we, and have identified the place where the Jewish folk and the universal masses overlap. Der Nister's answer to the struggle between particularity and universality, between Jewishness and whatever the alternatives were, was not or, but and. Thank you.